It's 8 a.m. and I'm drinking coffee and listening to public radio. This is a constant at our house. The host is interviewing a man who has purged his life. At least that's how I'm interpreting the interview. He has given up all of his worldly possessions and is now leading an infinitely more meaningful life. He has cast off the shackles of belongings. As I listened, I became more and more irritated and then kind of angry. I'm an artist. I make objects that I want to live in people's homes. This is how I make a living, but more importantly, it gives real meaning to my art practice. So is my anger just kind of fear that something that was so important to me maybe is irrelevant to mainstream society? I hope and think it's deeper than this. In my dad's 74th year, he announced to me that he expected a portrait as a gift for his 75th birthday. I don't consider myself a portrait painter at all, but I couldn't refuse his request. My dad had been battling cancer for several years, and we knew there weren't going to be many more birthdays. And I knew he wanted this for my mom as a memorial, something that would talk about his character and his life, a living representation of it. Now, I don't know if it's the best artwork I ever made, but it's a great example about how art, artifact, and memento can merge sometimes. I knew that object would have a really important place in my mother's home. My mom and dad have always had treasured belongings. Middle-class parents with 5 kids and a mortgage sitting at 22%. There wasn't a lot of extra cash around the house. But they were the original DIYers, farm kids. My dad could fix a car, fix the plumbing, and rebuild sections of our home. My mom liked to sew, paint walls, hang wallpaper, and was always looking at different design magazines and books for ideas. We used to joke that they rebuilt our house one room at a time. And by the time they got to the final room, the first one was outdated and needed to be renovated. But through all this change, there were constants, objects that were important to them. A carved elephant, a gift from my uncle's time in India. Black and white prints from my mom's lifelong Australian roommate. Heirlooms, handmade objects, and even some artwork. As I was growing up, my artwork got integrated into the household. A tip for parents of artistic children. If you would like to receive lifelong gifts of artwork, just keep up the original artwork. Your child will continue to give you gifts, hoping that one day you'll take down the first oil painting they ever painted. Hasn't happened. My parents instilled in me a love of making things and a fearless attempt to master craft. When I told them I was going to enter a BFA program in university, they were supportive, but probably very concerned. It didn't seem like a clear path to an occupation. I went into my first year, kind of a modernist art department. I took color theory, life drawing. But as I entered second year, I realized there was a shift taking place, postmodernism. Now, I'm not an art historian or a philosopher, but for me, the French philosopher Foucault opened up a whole new world, where we could think about the multiplicity of history. Who has the voice in history? The voice of marginalized people. This really opened up a space in my art practice. I started exploring storytelling. I created my own system of iconology based on everyday objects, like Dorothy's red shoes. And I also started to think about how community history could speak to larger social concepts. This went on to looking at stories from my family. I actually started to do a series of stories that my dad and his brothers used to tell around the supper table. And then I did a big project on the alphabetical railway on the prairies, where I actually went and looked at archival sources for stories. Over the last 10 years, I completed a project called Quiet Stories from Canadian Places. I interviewed hundreds of people across Canada. And then I took those stories and I responded to them by painting places and making small audio artworks. Artists have always had a historical role. This is formalized in the practice of historic painting, but it's also evident in how art and objects are used to animate certain time periods. Artists go beyond the snapshot to capture history. They do it through materials, stylistic changes, how they are working, and the geography they occupy can all be factors that transform their work from merely artwork to luxury artifact. And oh, what luxury! It seems like a month doesn't go by that we don't hear of some historic or modern masterpiece being auctioned off for millions of dollars. This is really far removed from my art practice. I make art about everyday people and everyday places. I exhibit them in public galleries, and then I distribute them through the commercial gallery system. I like to think that commercial galleries are just a part of mainstream retail culture. But comments my friends and family have made over the years make me think that this might not be true. Why is it that original art should be seen as some sort of elitist or indulgent luxury when we consider something like a high-end electronic sort of a necessary luxury? 3 years ago, I suffered a tibial plateau fracture. Emergency surgery, and 6 screws later, I ended up on the couch for 13 weeks. I watched a lot of home renovation television. As the drugs wore off, I got a lot more critical about it. Multiple programs remade people's homes and seemingly their lives. Objects and furniture were stripped away to make a much more aesthetically pleasing space. Now, I come from those DIY roots, so I'm not knocking renovation. And I'm not saying that trained interior designers and decorators can't improve the flow of space and the aesthetic nature that we occupy. What bothered me was the most important things in my home. My original artwork, my heirlooms, my collectibles were completely absent from this television-friendly process. There was no place for handmade objects, fine craft, things that had deep connection to the family. Sometimes the designers would haul the family out and show them furniture and high-end appliances, but they never took them to their local art gallery. There was no place in the process for the careful purchase and protection of meaningful objects. I've been collecting art since my early 20s. It started out with inexpensive work from fellow students. But as I had a little more money, I started to buy established artists. My first big purchase was made with a $500 inheritance I got from my grandmother. A painting by Canadian artist Wyona Mulcaster, Girl Sawing Wood. At the time, the $500 was a huge amount of money, more than half a month's salary for me. But I've never regretted the purchase. It's a deep connection to my grandmother, her journey from the city, marrying a farmhand, and becoming a farmer. At the time of my purchase, I was really inspired by the story of Herb and Dorothy Vogel. Herb, a postal worker, and Dorothy, a librarian, lived in a rent-controlled apartment in New York. Over the course of 30 years, they spent half their income buying original artwork. Their collection of 4,800 artworks is considered to be one of the most significant collections of contemporary art existing in the world today. In 1992, they finally donated that collection to the National Gallery in Washington. In a later documentary created by filmmaker Megumi Sasaki, she said it was really difficult to work with Herb and Dorothy. They couldn't articulate why they liked something. They just say things like, "It's beautiful, I like it." She'd resigned herself to making a 20-minute short. When one of the artists she interviewed for the project, Lucio Pozzi, said to her, "What's important about the Vogels is that they aren't academic. They did everything on intuition." As another artist put it in the documentary, something goes from the eye to the soul without going through the brain. Herb and Dorothy inspired me not only to buy artwork, but they made it seem natural that everyday people should have original art objects in their home. Now, I know as an artist that people collect art for many different reasons. Sometimes they like the subject matter of a piece or the emotional tone of it. Sometimes it's the material practice, or it makes a new cultural connection for them, or a new form of expression. I've asked people over the years, what's the difference between something original and handmade and a poster or a reproduction? They all say there's something distinctly different. There's a sense of a life or an energy, they'll say, to the work. One friend said to me, I stand in front of a painting in my home and I imagine stroke by stroke how the artist created that work. The intention and the energy of the artist speaks through the painting to me as I look at it in my home every day. As an artist, this is what I dream about for my artwork. A place in people's lives. Artwork that gets moved from place to place with that person, viewed in the morning light and in evening lamplight. Art that changes meaning for that person as they age and change. What I wish for others is also the experience I have had of deeply connecting with an original object and bringing it into my personal homescape. Something that won't be replaced like technology in a year or two. My dream is that art and objects be essential, not disposable. Not just cast away on an estate sale on a front lawn, but a tangible discussion point in our lives for who we are and what we want to surround ourselves with. A couple of years after my dad passed away, my mom moved out of our family home. Going through a house that had been occupied for 44 years was overwhelming. To help herself, my mom made an Excel spreadsheet. She put images on it of all the things that were important to her. She called it My Valued Items. It had photos, memorabilia, carvings, and paintings. All of these items went with her to her new condo or were carefully distributed to family members. As part of this process, my mom emailed the list to each of her children and asked them to mark off what they'd like to inherit. She still complains to this day that hardly anyone returned it. To me, the youngest child who actually returned the list. My mom sees this as her children rejecting her treasured objects, neglecting their family history, buying into that new disposable commercial culture. I asked my sister why she hadn't responded to the list, several times in fact. She said it was too difficult, too emotional. When she started to go through it, it brought up memories of my grandparents, my father, our family life growing up, and thoughts about losing my mother. She had a deep connection to the objects and artwork on that list. It helped to define her family experience and who she is. Not everybody has family heirlooms or even pleasant family history. What we surround ourselves with may be a reflection of where we come from or not. But we have the opportunity to really consider our surroundings, who we are and how that's reflected in our homes. I would challenge people to go to places where original art and fine craft are being displayed and sold. Talk to artists and art dealers about the work, why it was made, how it was made, and the intentions behind it. Open yourself up to the opportunity to engage with something original and maybe unexpected. Imagine if you purchased objects if you were going to have them for a lifetime. Selective consumption of meaningful objects. A much more environmental friendly approach. Also, talk about your treasured belongings. Give context and meaning to these things for your family and friends. Surround yourselves with things that speak to your heart. Don't just purge, but also cherish. Get a little more with your more.